Under the wide Texas sky, the sun bled gold over the dusty horizon, painting the world in shades of fire and sorrow. The land stretched endlessly, wild and quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves striking dry earth. Miles from any comfort or company, a lone rider cut across the plains, his shadow long and sure against the dying light. His name was Luke Callahan, a man built from the same dust he rode on, hardened by wind and loss, yet carrying a heart that still remembered what it meant to hope. Luke had seen enough of the world to know that love and pain often shared the same saddle. The Civil War had taken his brothers and left him with a scar that ran deeper than the one on his shoulder. When he returned home, the Callahan ranch stood half broken, the fences down, the barn leaning, and silence where laughter used to be. But he rebuilt it, board by board, until the wind once again carried the sound of cattle and the smell of hay. He told himself he'd live quietly, work the land, and keep his distance from the world's cruelty. That promise held, right up until the day he found her. It happened on a late summer evening, when the sun hung low and the sky burned orange. Luke was driving a stray heifer back toward the ranch when he spotted something unusual along the edge of the creek, a shape that didn't belong in the wilderness. As he rode closer, his horse shied, nostrils flaring. It wasn't a wild animal. It was a woman. She lay by the water's edge, her dress torn, her hands scraped, the dirt and bruises painting her like some tragic ghost of the prairie. Luke dismounted, his instincts torn between caution and concern. The woman didn't move until his shadow fell over her. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds before rain, tired, scared, and full of stories she hadn't spoken yet. She looked like she'd been running for miles. Her shoes were gone, her lips cracked, and the marks on her arms told the truth before she ever could. Someone had hurt her. Badly. Luke didn't ask questions. The West wasn't a place for soft curiosity. He simply scooped her up, set her across his horse, and rode hard for the ranch. The ride back was silent except for the sound of hooves and her faint breathing. She never spoke, and he never pushed her to. By the time they reached the Callahan ranch, night had fallen. The stars were out, cold and clear, like they'd been watching men's sins for centuries. Luke carried her inside, lit the fire, and let her rest in the spare room his mother once used for guests. She didn't eat much, didn't drink much, and slept like someone afraid to dream. In town, folks talked. The next morning, when Luke rode in for supplies, whispers followed him like dust. He heard pieces of her story before she ever told him herself. The woman's name was Clara. She'd lived in Willow Creek, a small settlement 15 miles east. Word was, she'd been married to a man named Vernon Tate, a rancher, cruel and proud, the kind of man who smiled only when others suffered. They said she'd lost 3 babies, all girls, and after the last one, Vernon turned on her like she was to blame. Then one day, she was gone. The town said she ran. Her husband said she'd brought shame to his name. Folks didn't question it much. In the West, people had short memories for other people's pain. Luke kept her safe on his ranch for days that turned into weeks. She worked when she could, feeding the hens, mending torn blankets, and moving quietly through the house like she didn't belong. Luke never pushed her to talk, but her silence said enough. Sometimes he'd catch her standing by the porch, looking out at the horizon with that same haunted stare, the look of someone who'd been thrown away and wasn't sure if she wanted to be found again. But there was something about her strength, buried beneath the fear. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. She just kept going, one breath at a time. And maybe that's what stirred something in Luke. He'd known pain, but hers was different, quieter, heavier, the kind that settles into your bones. Weeks passed, and word began to spread that Vernon Tate was looking for his wife. Men had seen him asking questions, riding through towns, carrying the kind of rage that makes other men nervous. Luke knew it was only a matter of time before he came knocking. One afternoon, while fixing the corral fence, Luke heard the faint echo of hooves in the distance. He looked up to see a group of riders approaching, dust swirling around them like a storm. 3 men, all wearing guns and faces that didn't belong to friendly visitors. Luke's jaw tightened. He didn't need an introduction to know who sent them. The lead rider, tall and sharp-eyed, called out from the gate, asking if Luke had seen a runaway woman, small, brown hair, scared-looking. Luke said no, voice calm, hands steady. The man studied him for a long moment, then spat into the dirt and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and bad intentions. When they were gone, Luke went straight to the house. Clara stood by the window, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had seen them too. Luke told her they'd be back, and that if she wanted to stay safe, she'd have to trust him. She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. That night, he moved her things to the small cabin behind the barn, a place hidden from the road and out of sight. It wasn't much, but it was safe. The days that followed were tense. Luke worked his ranch like nothing had changed, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the ridgelines, the road, the creek. Every night, he made sure Clara had food, water, and enough wood for the fire. He'd linger sometimes, listening to the wind against the cabin walls, wondering how someone so broken could still stand so strong. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the world in shades of amber and red, Luke found himself watching her through the window. She was sewing, the light catching her hair like strands of gold. For the first time since he found her, she looked at peace. Something about that moment hit him harder than any bullet could. He realized then that this wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't dare name it. Not yet. But it was there, growing quietly like a wildflower in the dust. That night, as coyotes howled in the distance and the stars burned above, Luke knew one thing for certain: the West had given him back a reason to fight. And even if the storm came for them both, he'd face it head-on. Because sometimes, a man's redemption doesn't come from what he rebuilds, but from who he saves. The next morning rose heavy with silence. The air held a strange stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath. The sun climbed slowly, spreading gold over the hills and glinting against the wire fences of the Callahan ranch. Luke was already up before dawn, feeding the horses, the steady rhythm of work keeping his mind clear. But beneath that calm surface, tension brewed like thunder waiting to break. It had been a week since those riders came asking about the woman, and Luke knew men like that didn't give up easily. The kind of men who followed orders from someone like Vernon Tate didn't stop until they were paid to. He'd seen their kind during the war, eyes that didn't blink, hearts that didn't flinch. Luke tried to shake off the thought as he carried a pail of water from the well. Across the yard, he saw Clara walking from the cabin, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She moved more slowly these days, still cautious, but stronger than before. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though her eyes still carried shadows, they also held something new, a flicker of peace. She'd begun helping him with small chores around the ranch, feeding the hens, washing linens, and tending to the garden that had grown wild in his neglect. Luke didn't say much, but every time he saw her working in the sun, it reminded him how fragile life was, and how stubborn it could be. That afternoon, as he fixed a broken rail by the pen, a low rumble caught his ear. Hooves again, but slower this time, heavier. Luke turned, eyes narrowing against the glare. 2 riders came up the trail, both strangers. They didn't look like hired guns. They wore dusty hats, travel-worn coats, and the kind of expression that said they'd been riding a long time. One of them raised a hand in greeting, calm and polite. Luke met them by the gate, hand resting near the handle of his rifle. The taller of the 2 introduced himself as Sheriff Morgan from Willow Creek. He said they were investigating reports of a missing woman, and her husband was offering a reward for her return. Luke's gut clenched at the name, but he kept his face unreadable. The sheriff spoke slowly, carefully, like he'd dealt with his share of liars. Luke told him the truth, that he hadn't seen any woman fitting that description. The sheriff studied him, eyes narrowing just enough to show suspicion, then nodded. He didn't press further, but Luke knew the lawman wasn't convinced. The sheriff left, but not before saying he might return to ask more questions. When the sound of hooves faded, Luke exhaled the breath he'd been holding. The West had never been kind to secrets, and this one was starting to weigh heavily on him. That night, clouds rolled in from the south. The sky turned dark and restless, the wind picking up dust from the open plains. Luke lit the lantern and stepped out to check on the livestock, the scent of rain thick in the air. As he neared the barn, he saw a faint light flicker in the cabin window. Clara was awake. She sat by the table, staring at a small framed photo, one Luke hadn't seen before. Probably something she'd hidden in her dress when she ran. It showed a young woman holding a baby, both smiling faintly. He realized then it must have been one of her girls. She looked up suddenly, like she could feel him watching. Her eyes met his through the glass, and for a long moment, the storm outside seemed to disappear. There was something between them, quiet, unspoken, but strong. The kind of bond that didn't need words, born out of shared pain and silent understanding. When the rain finally came, it came hard. Thunder rolled across the valley, lightning flashing over the ridge. Luke stood at the porch, watching the storm lash against the land. It was a wild thing, the kind of storm that could tear down fences and test a man's will. And in that chaos, he thought about her. About the way she'd fought to survive, how she still carried kindness in her eyes despite all she'd lost. He realized that protecting her wasn't just a duty anymore. It was a purpose. The next morning, the world smelled of wet earth and renewal. But peace never lasts long in the West. While Luke was mending a fence post near the southern trail, he heard the faint crack of a rifle echo through the hills. It was distant but distinct. A warning. He mounted his horse and rode toward the ridge, scanning the land. From the rise, he could see dust kicking up near the old creek bed, 3 riders again, the same ones from before. They were moving slowly, circling the ranch like wolves testing a fence. Luke rode back fast, his mind already working through what needed to be done. By the time he reached the yard, Clara was on the porch, clutching her shawl, eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to ask, she knew. Luke told her to stay in the cabin, no matter what she heard. He saddled another horse, loaded his rifle, and set out toward the south trail. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew it was coming whether he wanted it or not. As the riders approached, Luke stopped at the fence line. The leader smirked, the same man from before, scar running down his cheek, eyes cold as the steel on his belt. He asked again about the woman. Luke told him the same lie, voice steady. The man didn't believe him. He swung down from his horse, hand resting on his pistol. For a long moment, the air hung heavy between them, the sound of cicadas rising like a warning. Then, just as suddenly, the man turned his horse and spat into the dirt. He said something under his breath that Luke couldn't quite catch, but the look in his eyes said enough, this wasn't over. When they rode off, Luke watched them until they disappeared over the ridge. He knew they'd report back to Tate, and when they did, the Real storm would come. That evening, Luke sat by the barn, cleaning his rifle under the fading light. He wasn't a man who went looking for fights, but he knew how to end them when they came to his door. Clara stepped out quietly, bringing him a plate of bread and beans. She didn't speak, but when their hands brushed, the air shifted. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude. Fear. Maybe even love. She knew he was risking everything for her, and that knowledge sat heavily on both their hearts. The following days moved slowly, the calm before the storm. Luke worked from dawn till dusk, his every motion sharpened by awareness. He checked the fences, counted the cattle, fixed the gates, all while keeping one eye on the horizon. Clara continued to stay near the cabin, but sometimes she'd walk out to where he was working, bringing water or food. Those moments, small as they were, started to feel like something sacred. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the hills in copper and blood, Luke stood by the fence watching the herd. Clara came up beside him, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. The world around them was quiet, save for the soft rustle of wine through the grass. Luke thought about saying something, anything, but the words stuck. Instead, he simply stood there, the distance between them heavy with things neither dared to speak. The land stretched endlessly before them, wild and unforgiving, yet in that moment, it felt almost kind. That night, the silence of the plains was broken by the faint echo of a horse's cry. Luke jolted awake. He moved fast, stepping onto the porch, scanning the dark horizon. In the distance, the flicker of lanterns glowed like fireflies in the night. Riders, more than a few. They were coming. He turned toward the cabin. The light was still on inside, and Clara was already standing by the window, fear etched into her face. Luke told her to gather what she could and stay hidden. There was no more room for hesitation. The riders reached the outer gate just as dawn began to rise. Dust swirled around them, the red sun glinting off their rifles. At their head rode Vernon Tate himself, tall, broad, and mean, with a face carved from cruelty and pride. He called out across the yard, demanding his wife be returned. His voice cut through the air like a whip, filled with venom and ownership. Luke stepped forward, calm as the wind before the storm. He told Tate there was no woman here, and that he'd best turn his men around before trouble started. Tate laughed, a sound as hollow as the desert wind, and ordered his men to search the ranch. They moved toward the barn, spreading out like vultures. Luke's hand tightened around his rifle. He called out once more, voice steady but low, warning them to leave. When the men didn't stop, he fired a shot into the dirt at their feet. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder. Horses reared, men cursed, and for a heartbeat, the world froze. Tate glared at Luke, eyes blazing with fury. He raised his own gun, and time seemed to hold its breath. The first bullet struck the post beside Luke, splintering wood. He returned fire, aiming low, the shot grazing one of the men's shoulders. Chaos erupted, gunfire, shouting, the smell of smoke and gunpowder thick in the morning air. Clara crouched inside the cabin, heart pounding, the sound of battle echoing through the walls. Luke held his ground, moving between the troughs and wagons, his rifle steady. He wasn't shooting to kill, only to drive them off. But Tate wasn't there for a warning. He wanted blood. As the fight raged on, Luke caught sight of Tate circling toward the cabin. Panic surged through him. He shouted for Clara to stay low and sprinted across the yard, bullets biting the dirt at his heels. The air burned with noise and fury. He reached the porch just as Tate kicked the cabin door open. For a moment, everything slowed, two men, both carved by loss, facing each other in a world that had forgotten mercy. Tate raised his gun, but before he could fire, Luke tackled him. They hit the floor hard, the gun skidding away. The fight was brutal, raw, a clash of rage and resolve. Tate swung with blind fury, shouting words that made Clara shrink against the wall. Luke fought back with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but one thing worth protecting. When it was over, Tate lay beaten, breath ragged, pride shattered. Luke stood over him, chest heaving, the light of dawn spilling through the broken door. He could have ended it, one pull of the trigger, but he didn't. He simply told him to leave and never come back. Tate spat blood, hate burning in his eyes, but he knew defeat when he saw it. He called for his men, and one by one they retreated, disappearing into the rising sun. As the sound of hooves faded, Luke turned back toward Clara. She stood there, tears streaking down her face, not from fear but from something deeper, relief, disbelief, maybe love. Outside, the land was quiet again, save for the wind brushing over the fields. Luke dropped his rifle, the weight of it finally too much to carry. He looked out toward the horizon, where the light was breaking clean and gold, and he knew one truth clearer than any sermon: sometimes, a man's redemption isn't in saving himself. It's in saving someone the world forgot. The sun climbed slowly over the Callahan ranch that morning, spilling light over the broken door and the scattered shells in the dirt. The echoes of gunfire still lingered in the air, ghosts of violence fading into the hum of waking birds. Luke stood in the yard, bruised, dusty, and breathing the taste of iron and smoke. The storm had passed, but its shadow clung to the land. Inside the cabin, Clara sat on the floor, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The fear that had ruled her for so long was gone, replaced by something steadier, something quiet and strong. When Luke stepped through the doorway, she lifted her eyes to him, and in that look he saw everything words could never hold: gratitude, pain, and a fragile hope. He patched the broken door, cleaned the spent shells, and buried the bloodstains beneath fresh earth. No one came that day, and for the first time in weeks, the ranch stood still. The cattle grazed in peace, the wind carried only the sound of the creek, and the air felt lighter, like the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Luke knew it wasn't over. Men like Vernon Tate didn't vanish forever. But for now, they had a reprieve, and in the West, peace was always temporary but precious. The days that followed were quiet, a slow return to living. Clara helped him mend fences and tend the animals. She began humming while she worked, soft tunes that drifted through the barn like whispers of a past life. Sometimes Luke would stop what he was doing just to listen. Her voice reminded him of spring rain on dry earth, gentle, healing, and alive. The townsfolk, however, had their own way of twisting the truth. When word reached Willow Creek that Tate had returned beaten and humiliated, stories spread like wildfire. Some said Luke Callahan had turned outlaw. Others said he bewitched a man's wife. None of it mattered to Luke, but he knew gossip in a small western town had the power to ruin faster than bullets. A week later, Sheriff Morgan rode up to the ranch again. His horse was lathered in dust, his expression stern but not unkind. He said Tate had sworn vengeance, claiming Luke had kidnapped his wife and stolen his property. The law had no proof either way, but Morgan warned that the town council wanted to investigate. Luke didn't argue. He simply told the sheriff the truth, that the woman had come to him beaten and starving, that he'd only given her shelter. Morgan listened, said nothing for a while, then nodded slowly. He told Luke to stay put and keep the peace, but there was a heaviness in his tone that said trouble wasn't done. After the sheriff left, Luke leaned on the porch rail, staring out at the hills. He'd fought wars before, but this one felt different. Bullets were easy, words were harder. And now it wasn't just his reputation at stake, it was hers. Clara joined him outside as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in rose and violet. She stood close but not touching, her presence enough to ease the tension in his chest. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken things. He'd saved her life, and now she was part of his. That night, the wind carried the scent of rain again. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and Luke sat by the fire, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. Clara sat across the room, sewing a torn sleeve. Every so often, her eyes drifted toward him, soft and uncertain. They were two souls scarred by different kinds of pain, yet drawn by the same quiet need, the need to belong somewhere, to someone, even in a world that didn't forgive easily. The next morning, Luke hitched the wagon and told her he was riding to town for supplies. Clara wanted to go too. He hesitated, knowing what kind of stares awaited her, but she insisted. The fear that once ruled her had burned away, replaced by quiet resolve. Willow Creek sat nestled in a valley of dust and memory. As they rode down the main street, heads turned, whispers followed. The saloon doors swung, voices hushed. Luke kept his hat low, jaw tight. Clara sat straight beside him, refusing to hide. They stopped at the general store, the creak of the wagon wheels loud in the tense quiet. Inside, Luke gathered feed and nails while Clara looked at fabric, her fingers brushing over faded colors she hadn't touched in years. The storekeeper's wife, an older woman with kind eyes, came over quietly and handed Clara a small ribbon. Said every lady deserved a bit of pretty, no charge. It was the first kindness the town had shown her. But not everyone was kind. As they stepped back outside, two men standing near the saloon muttered loud enough to be heard. Words like shame and stolen floated through the air. Luke ignored them, but Clara's face paled. She wasn't used to being looked at like that anymore. Back on the wagon, the silence stretched. Luke reached over and laid his hand gently over hers. It wasn't much, just a simple gesture, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. When they returned to the ranch, the sky had turned gray with dust clouds rolling in from the west. Storms, both real and human, were closing in again. That evening, Sheriff Morgan rode out once more. He brought bad news. Vernon Tate had been found dead 2 towns over, a bullet through his chest. No witnesses, no trail. But word was already spreading that Luke Callahan had done it. Luke said nothing, but inside, the weight settled heavily. He hadn't left the ranch since the fight, but he knew that wouldn't matter to people who needed someone to blame. The sheriff sighed and said he'd try to hold off the accusations, but he couldn't promise the town would listen. The law had its limits, and the West had its own kind of justice, rough, quick, and often wrong. After Morgan left, Luke sat outside until the stars came out. Clara joined him, her face pale in the moonlight. She asked if he'd done it, and he told her no. She believed him, not because of words but because she'd seen his heart, steady, scarred, and honorable. Days passed in uneasy calm. Luke worked from dawn till dusk, trying to keep the ranch running while waiting for the next blow to fall. Clara started baking again, small loaves she left to cool by the window. The smell filled the house, softening its edges. It was starting to feel like home. Then one morning, the sound of hooves shattered the peace. A group of men approached, not deputies this time but townsfolk carrying rifles and hard eyes. They called for Luke, accusing him of murder, saying they wanted answers. Luke stepped out, hands empty, voice calm. He told them the truth again, but fear makes people deaf. The leader, a stocky rancher named Cole Brady, said Tate's brother had sworn revenge, and if the law wouldn't act, they would. The men spread out, circling the yard. Clara stood at the door, watching with dread. Luke's mind raced, calculating his chances. He could fight, but there were too many. And any wrong move would end with blood in the dirt. Then, before anyone could act, a single voice cut through the tension. Sheriff Morgan rode up fast, his badge catching the sun. He shouted for everyone to stand down. The mob hesitated. Morgan dismounted and walked to the front, his eyes hard as flint. He said new evidence had come in. Tate's horse had been found near the river, hoofprints matching another man seen fleeing town that night. Luke was cleared. The sheriff said it plain, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Reluctantly, the mob lowered their guns. Cole muttered something under his breath, but he backed off. One by one, they rode away, leaving dust and shame behind them. When the yard was empty again, Morgan looked at Luke with quiet respect. He said the West needed more men who stood for something besides pride. Then he tipped his hat and rode out. As the sound of hooves faded, Luke turned toward Clara. She was still at the doorway, her eyes wide, trembling with the aftershock of fear and relief. When he stepped toward her, she didn't move away this time. She reached for his hand, and for the first time since he'd found her by the creek, she smiled, small, tired, but real. That night, the ranch was silent except for the crickets. Luke sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill over the land. Clara was asleep in the next room, breathing soft and steady. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. He thought about everything that had happened, the fights, the accusations, the pain, and realized that somewhere along the way, she had become part of him. The loneliness that had once filled every corner of his soul had lifted. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The West had a way of taking as much as it gave. But he knew this, no matter what came next, he'd face it with her. Because some things in life were worth the fight, not for glory, not for pride, but for love. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and rain, and Luke Callahan sat there beneath that wide Texas sky knowing that sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones fought to keep a heart safe. Under a sky thick with storm clouds, the wind howled over the wide plains, dragging dust and memories across the open land. The town of Red Hollow seemed to hold its breath that morning, as if it too knew the final reckoning was near. The ranch lay quiet, save for the restless snort of horses and the rustle of leaves fighting the wind. Caleb Monroe stood at the barn doorway, his face carved with exhaustion and fire. Weeks of struggle had brought him here, and everything he loved, everything he had fought for, balanced on the edge of this day. The word had spread through town like wildfire. Sheriff Dern and his hired men were coming, not for justice, but for vengeance, riding under the pretense of law. May's name had been dragged through every tavern and church corner, the woman who defied the man who ruined her, the woman who now found shelter with the rancher stubborn enough to stand between her and the world's cruelty. But Caleb didn't flinch from it anymore. He'd seen the truth in her eyes, seen what real courage looked like, and that kind of truth was worth bleeding for. May was inside, packing what little they had. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the storm of uncertainty that clawed at her chest. She looked out the window, watching the horizon darken as the first thunder rumbled over the hills. She knew they might not make it through the day. Yet even in the fear, there was a calm, the kind that only comes when someone has already lost everything once and refuses to lose again. She whispered a prayer not for herself but for Caleb, the man who had carried her dignity back from the ashes. Caleb saddled his horse, the same mare he had raised from a foal. The saddle creaked under the weight of his resolve. He looked toward the open field stretching beyond the ranch, the land he had built with his bare hands. It was more than property, it was his soul laid across the dirt and grass. If this were where it ended, it would end where his heart began. The sound came faintly at first, a distant rumble of hooves against the earth, growing louder, angrier. The posse rode in a line, dust rising behind them like smoke from a battlefield. Caleb stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the barn door, eyes steady, jaw locked. He didn't reach for his gun yet. There was still a part of him that believed reason might survive the hatred of men, but deep down, he knew the truth, reason had long been buried beneath pride and rumor. May stepped out behind him. Her dress whipped in the wind, hair loose, eyes fierce. Caleb turned his head slightly, enough to see her in the corner of his vision. She shook her head, as if begging him not to do this, not to meet violence with violence. But Caleb only nodded once, a silent promise that no matter what came, she would not be touched again. The sheriff's voice carried across the yard, sharp as the crack of thunder. His words were soaked in venom, filled with all the arrogance that comes when a man hides his weakness behind a badge. He accused May of wickedness, of defiance, of sins that didn't exist. He called Caleb a fool, a lover of shame. The men behind him laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. Caleb didn't answer. He just stood there, the storm building behind his eyes. Then came the moment when words failed. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. The world slowed. Lightning split the sky, and the rain began to fall in heavy, punishing drops. Caleb drew faster than thought, not out of hatred, but instinct, the instinct to protect, to defend what was sacred. The shot cracked through the rain, echoing across the open plain. The sheriff staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, before falling into the mud he had made of his own heart. Chaos erupted. The men drew their weapons, firing through the storm. Horses screamed, the barn splintered, and the air filled with smoke and thunder. Caleb moved with the precision of a man who had long accepted his fate. He fought not for glory, not for reputation, but for her, for the one soul who had ever seen the good in him. He took a bullet to the shoulder but kept fighting, blood mixing with rain, his hat lost in the wind, his breath ragged. May ran toward him, dragging him behind a wagon. She pressed her hands against his wound, trembling but steady. He told her, without words, to stay down, to survive. Another gun went off. One of the sheriff's men had turned his aim toward her. Caleb pushed her aside, rising with the last of his strength, and fired once more. The man fell, his weapon slipping into the mud. Silence followed, except for the storm's final roar. When the rain finally began to ease, the field was quiet. The surviving men of the posse had fled, leaving behind the wreckage of their pride. Caleb knelt in the mud, blood running down his arm, breathing in the scent of rain and gunpowder. May crawled to him, holding his face in her hands. Her tears mixed with the rain as she whispered something only the wind could carry. He smiled, faintly, as if the pain didn't matter anymore. He didn't die that day. The town doctor came, begrudgingly, brought by the few who had seen the truth with their own eyes. They said he'd never use that arm the same again, but Caleb didn't care. He'd done what needed doing. The town changed after that, slow, reluctant, but it changed. Rumors faded, and new stories took root. People began to see May not as the outcast they once scorned, but as the woman who stood tall beside the man who had faced down the storm. Months later, under the soft gold of a summer dawn, Caleb and May rode out across the open range. The land stretched endlessly, the horizon painted with light. The ranch still stood, rebuilt stronger than before. Life was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after chaos, where every breath feels borrowed and blessed. Caleb's arm ached as he held the reins, but he didn't mind. He looked at May riding beside him, her hair catching the morning light, her face no longer haunted but full of peace. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of meaning, a language born from all they had endured. As they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Caleb stopped and looked out over the land. The grass swayed gently, and somewhere far off, a hawk circled the sky. May leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. For a long while, neither moved. The world had tested them, broken them, and somehow, remade them. And in that moment, beneath the vast western sky, it was clear, the story wasn't about revenge or redemption, but about love that refused to die. The kind of love that stands its ground, even when the world turns its back. The kind of love that saves not just a woman or a man, but everything good left inside them. Years later, folks still spoke of that storm, of the day the rancher faced down the sheriff's men. Some said he was reckless. Some said he was a fool. But the ones who knew better, the ones who'd seen what he'd done, called it something else. They called it devotion, the kind that can't be taught or bought, only felt deep enough to change a man forever. When the winds of Red Hollow whisper through the plains at night, they say you can still hear the echo of hoofbeats, two riders moving side by side, chasing the horizon where the sky meets the earth. A man and a woman who found their forever, not in the eyes of others, but in each other's courage. Because in the end, the West remembers not the guns or the glory, but the hearts that refused to give up when the world turned cold. And somewhere out there, under a fading sunset, love still rides, wild, untamed, and free.